Hi everyone, welcome to another bonus content video. Today we're going to be looking up ETFs and their ESG ratings for ETFs. So again, there are sort of two companies I depend on for the data. There's MSCI and then Morningstar, which recently acquired Sustainalytics. So we'll start with MSCI. What we can do here is enter the ticker symbol for the ETF. Now, I'd like to do VEQT, the sort of Vanguard equity, but for whatever reason, it's not in here right now. So I'm just going to do the iShares version, the XEQT, which is this iShares Core Equity Portfolio. It's basically the same thing as VEQT. So again, this is like a non-sustainable ETF, so it just kind of gives us a benchmark. You can see that the fund gets an overall rating of single A, which is not terrible. Triple A would be the cleanest, double A, single A, triple B, double B, single B, and then triple C would sort of be the nastiest. From there, when we can see the distribution of all of the companies that are in here. So, this is an ETF with hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands and thousands of different companies. And so this is the distribution of ESG scores within this ETF. So we can see that there are some companies in here that are triple C or single B or double B that, we probably don't want to own, as sustainable investors, but they are going to be in the very standard default setting. As well, we get this weighted average carbon intensity. So this is tons of CO2 emissions per $1 million in sales. So this is a way of kind of basically saying the sort of average carbon emissions, and it's normalized based on how big your company is. So again, very standard. This puts us in the middle, sort of moderate 186.3 tons. You can see here green versus brown revenue, that fossil fuel-based revenues. Obviously, this fund is going to have a bunch of fossil fuels in here. What's kind of cool is that, hey, it does have green revenues, which is like, not bad. It's nice for me that in the standard fund, green is now higher than fossil fuel revenues. That's pretty cool. It also does give us the corporate governance breakdown, so we can look at the board independence, which is the separation of sort of the board and the CEO, and having these independent board is really important. And the board diversity, percentage of women on the board of directors, 31%, not great. Obviously, a lot of work needs to be done there. From there, we do get companies that are flagged for controversies. So UNGC, this is the UN Global Compact Principles. So these are going to be some really, really nasty things. Things like child labor or, just really, human rights abuses, things like that. So there are 27 companies in here. Also, the OECD has these controversies. So this could be related to the environment or customers or human rights, things like that. 34 companies with violations. We do have controversial weapons. These are going to be things like landmines, cluster munitions, chemicals, blinding laser weapons. Oh my goodness, this stuff is horrible. There are 16 companies in here that sell these, and there are 38 tobacco companies. You can see here that at this point it's tobacco producers that derive equal to or greater than 5% revenue from tobacco production, as well as tobacco distributors, suppliers, retailers, etc. So, 38 companies in there. So a lot of nasty stuff in here. This would be sort of the worst of the worst. If we wanted to compare it to something, I could very easily do GEQT, which is sort of a doing less evil option. This is the iShares ESG equity ETF portfolio. You can see it has a triple A rating, which is obviously much higher. There is still a distribution here, but it gets rid of the worst companies, right? The companies have to be triple B or above. The weighted average carbon intensity is way lower at 91.5 tons. Fossil fuel-based revenues, only 0.1%. It's really hard to get to zero. There are a couple of ETFs that do, but it's really, really challenging. Oftentimes there's going to be a little bit of natural gas in here, but we still get the green revenues at 4.9%. Board independence and board diversity are going to be like marginally better, maybe. Like it really isn't focused too much on these things, but really it is, the reason we like it is that it is going to get rid of all of these different violations. So, pretty clear that in terms of the getting rid of the worst companies. So that's how we can look up ETFs on MSCI. Now let's head over to morningstar.ca and where we can do the same thing. I think I can look up VEQT here. It should be in this one. Here it is, the Vanguard All Equity ETF Portfolio. To get the ESG metrics, we're going to go into analysis. And then down here at the bottom, we get some ESG and some carbon risk metrics. So when it comes to the sustainability rating, again, this is a non-sustainable, this is like a benchmark. This is just a standard couch potato ETF, global equity ETF. It only has 2 planets out of 5, so that puts it somewhere between 20% to 40% among its peers. The way to read this is that the dotted line is the global category average. So the global category here is going to be global equity large cap. So compared to other global equity large cap, you can see that it actually has a higher ESG risk score, which is bad. That when it comes to Sustainalytics, we want a lower score equals lower risk. And so we can see here that, whatever that dotted line is here, the VEQT has a current score of 22.82, right, which is on the higher than average side. They do break it down between environmental risk, social risk, and governance risk. From there, we get some carbon metrics. This is the carbon risk score. Again, we want a low number. And you can see here the dotted line, the average is 7.28. And this one has a carbon risk score of 9.48. So this one is a little bit more carbon risk than the average. And the fossil fuel involvement is really high. 6.08 is the category average versus 12.23, which is really, really high. So, this probably is because of the exposure to Canadian equities. This one does have a higher percentage in Canadian stocks, which is probably why we have this higher fossil fuel involvement. To compare it, let's look at that sort of GEQT, which is the iShares ESG equity ETF portfolio, sort of a doing less evil option. Oops, I need to do the analysis. There we go. And now when I scroll down, we can see that it has a much better score, that it's kind of in this, 13th percentile. So 4 planets out of 5. We can see compared to this global category average, this has a much lower ESG risk score. It's got the current one is 19.79, which is great. The carbon metrics, I guess we don't have these, a little surprised here. It's a bit of a newer ETF, so, we don't always get them, but, my guess, because this one does get rid of fossil fuels, is that the carbon risk score would be quite lower and the fossil fuel involvement would be quite lower than the average. Again, it's going to be really, really hard to get this down to 0, but I would expect this one to have a lower percentage there. So nifty tools, obviously, the longer ETFs are around, if it's a brand new ETF, we might not get complete data, and so, but as the ETFs get a little bit older, this should populate. You can see this is as of March 31st, 2021, so, I'll wait patiently for them to update it. But hopefully this gives you some insight into how we look at the ESG scores and risk scores when it comes to ETFs. Know that these are tools that are free for you to use, and hopefully this will help you make a decision about which ETFs you want to purchase. Thanks for watching.